Hey folks, Matt Leck here with David Griscom. Hello, David.
How's it going, friends? Stoked to be doing this again.
It's going well. We're doing part 3, it is, of our Rosa
Yeah.
Luxemburg Reform Revolution reading series. Well, we're going to try to get through the remainder. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
Final.
No, I mean, I think, as people, again, if you haven't seen them, there'll be links in the show notes to see part 1 and part 2. We'll try to fill folks in so you can jump in, but, really, it's, sort of unfair to Rosa to jump into the conclusion of her book. and,
Mhm.
um, hope to get everything, but we'll try our best. But it's very worth it to go and look at the other two, because I think she makes a lot of really important points going through this. And I think as it goes, I mean, we're starting to build up to the crescendo. I mean, she's really taken apart Bernstein's arguments about, just like to really quickly like recap. um Bernstein basically is making these arguments that capitalism is entering into this new phase, right? Shifts in production and finance capital have sort of alleviated some of the crisis that's built into the capitalist system, and is arguing that the social democratic movement, right? And remember to just, another disclaimer: when you hear those terminologies, sometimes people assume all these other things. At this point, the socialist communist movement identify themselves as social democrats, as they did the same thing in Russia. It was only later, when Lenin started identifying their movement as Bolshevik or communist in opposition to the social democrats. So that's something that social democrats is origin of the socialist communist movement. There's a split. So sometimes I think, when people hear those terminologies, they sort of put on kind of contemporary debates or framings on this, and just remember that these sort of start at the same place, and then these distinctions are made later because of some of these splits.
Yeah, and I mean, it's probably important to note, like, the political context she's operating in is much more radical than ours
Oh
currently.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Bernstein probably is, like, not far from maybe, like, Bernie, right? Like,
Some
in
ways, yeah, no,
modern
I think
politics?
so. Yeah. I mean, like, and like the point, the reason we want to come back to it is, one, it's like a really important theoretical text, but two, like a lot of these arguments are very popular. And we'll come back to the union stuff in one of the other chapters. But she sort of criticizes some of these tendencies um, that sort of focus only on sort of what she would call like defensive mechanisms of like the labor movement, right? The working class movement, where those sort of become elevated into like the offensive strategies, and she thinks that that's a bit of a mistake. But yeah, no, I mean, this text really, this last bit here is, really breaks down some of the theoretical differences, some of the dangers, and we'll be able to jump into that. She criticizes some of the fixation on the cooperative economy, which again is like one of those things that's very popular and buzzy these days.
I
So
mean, she goes at, I mean, we can get to it in a second here. We got chapter 6 to get to first, but chapter 7 is co-op, co-ops, unions, and democracy.
mhm.
And she's going at all 3 of those, as, they're not gonna ultimately, deliver us, the final victory.
So I mean, I think in terms of time, if you've been following along, the arguments that Bernstein has been making, and again, I highly suggest you going back and listening to part 1 and part 2. Also, just for people who might be jumping in, you can get all these things on Marxist.org for free if you want to read them. They're not too difficult or long to read either.
Mhm.
Um, so for chapter 6, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in chapter 6, but I think we might just sort of give it a quick overview, just because more than anything, I think it's sort of looking back at the arguments that Bernstein is making, that she's been criticizing. And it starts out making this argument again that Bernstein is saying that, oh, because there's been shifts in capitalism, because there's more shareholders. Um, Capitalism is sort of entering into a new phase. If the previous phase was sort of dominated by large industries, now we're seeing the medium to small
Mhm.
capitalists. So like the amount of capitalists is growing, therefore like capitalism is sort of expanding and like democratizing, right? It's
Mm.
decentralizing itself. And it's funny because like this is actually like an argument that you get from like libertarians or like capitalist apologists, is that like, oh, more and more people can be, petty or small capitalists in the system, which means that it's good and it's for everybody.
Yeah.
And Rosa sort of takes issue with that. um, I'll just read this section here if that's all right, Matt, because I think it sort of highlights this. Bernstein denies the existence of the economic conditions for socialism in the society of today. On this count, his reasoning has undergone an interesting evolution. Um, and I'll skip this particular stuff about Germany here. And in the most favorable case, he could not even by demonstrating the persistence of middle-sized enterprises weaken in any the Marxian analysis, because the latter does not suppose as a condition for the realization of socialism either a definite rate of concentration of industry, that is, a definite delay of the realization of socialism, or, as we have already shown, the absolute disappearance of small capitalists, usually described as the disappearance of the petty bourgeoisie. And what she's getting at here again is like Bernstein sort of making the argument that like, oh, well, look, large industry was dominant in like the late 1800s. Now we're seeing small medium industry. And Rosa says like, well, one, that's not like a fundamental law of Marxism, and two, what this actually is not so much that capital is like sort of being broken up and split up, but rather that the concentration of like finance capital, which represents like the wealth of the capitalist class, is actually being combined into a larger force. And like, yeah, maybe it's sort of, there's like there's a mechanism in between. So instead of it just like straight up being like a Rockefeller or a Carnegie, uh,
Mhm.
it's like these large financial institutions that represent lots of the fortunes and the capital of many, many different capitalists.
Yeah, I mean, this strikes me as like the same argument where people are like, "Oh, 401ks or
Hmm.
wider, people holding stock is actually democratizing or socializing the economy." But to me, it seems like, and we get in to the split later over the anarchy of capitalism. It seems like, again, this is nothing she's been proven right on over the past 100 years. Like the shareholder economy that has seemed to like make a more sociopathic and detached form of capitalism. I mean, am I wrong about that? Like, like it was for the shareholders of different places, like ITT that led in like help with coups in South America. Like
Hmm.
that was ITT isn't just about telegraphs; it's also about moving money for like investors and stuff like that, right?
Or I mean, but also look what these shareholding organizations and structures mean for production for the working class. I mean, no better example than what happened at
Warrior
Ware
Met.
Met Coal,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
You know, those workers are being squeezed. Yeah, maybe not by like one personal individual like capitalist industrialist, but yes, a more blobby
Yeah.
finance capital, but it's functioning in the same way. It's like, yeah, some folks, like the amount of people who might be getting some money out of this might be increasing, but if you think that that actually means like a significant difference in like the kind of exploitation, you're wrong. And I'll just read
Mhm.
this bit right here. Um, Now, what is the significance of the extension of the system of shareholding societies? Economically, the spread of shareholding societies stands for the growing socialization of production under the capitalist form, right? Which is one of the arguments that Marxists make. Socialization not only of large, but also of middle size and small production. The extension of shareholding does not therefore contradict Marxist theory, but on the contrary, confirms it emphatically. What does the economic phenomenon of a shareholding society actually amount to? It represents, on the one hand, the unification of small fortunes into a large capital of production. It stands, on the other hand, for the separation of production from capitalist ownership. That is, it denotes that a double victory being won over the capitalist mode of production, but still on a capitalist base. And again, what she's saying here is that, Bernstein over here saying that, like, oh, look, small, medium-sized capital is like increasing on some metrics. That means that the Marxist theory about capitalism is needs to be updated. She's saying Absolutely not. What this is showing is that this power is so immense that now even like what you are creating, this false binary between like the small and the medium sized capitalists to the large industrial capitalists, is false, because they are now sort of all under the same umbrella, the same kind of system of production. And in the sense of like finance capital, right, in the shareholder class, um, actually incorporating even these kind of smaller, more localized industries into that same kind of system as the big, scary industrial ones, right? And like this fetish is like, it's very popular, I think, with like progressives. I think it's very popular with like capitalist reformers. Is the
Mm.
kind of fetishize the small to medium sized business versus like the big industrial one. Um, and if you look at like the history of capitalism, the working experience of people, those things operate under the same logic. They participate in the same kind of activities, and the fundamental reality of exploitation of the working people, that being said, like the working people produce the value, do the things, and the value that they create goes into the pockets of the shareholder, the owner of those companies, right? That only becomes intensified, rather than lessened, in this new phase. So this argument from Bernstein is that like we're entering into this new era is just factually wrong.
Yeah.
Um, she goes on to, we're going to try to, I hope this is making sense for folks, because we're going to try to sort of jump through this section just because it is sort of recapping a lot of the main arguments from the rest of the book, so we can get into the new stuff. She makes the argument too, um, that there's a difference that Bernstein gets confused about, where capitalist no longer signifies an isolated individual. The industrial capitalist of today is a collective person composed of hundreds and even thousands of individuals. The category capitalist has itself become a social category. It has become socialized within the framework of capitalist society, right? So he's looking at like a difference in number, and thinking that this actually means a difference in like kind, right, in type.
Mhm.
um
And you see her also taken task for, uh, relatedly, like moving from the relation of worker capitalist to rich and poor.
yes, and I think that's a really important bit too, right? And I think a lot of people on our side make this mistake as well, right? Where instead of sort of like, 'cause, like the important part of the Marxist theory, right, why it's different from like even like a liberal reformer theory, or fuck, even just like any kind of theory about inequality in like human society. Like the point is like, Marx was not the first person to say like, oh, there's inequality in the world, right? That's like in the Bible, right? That's like part of like, that's been a criticism in human society from the get-go.
Yeah.
The point that Marx makes is that he directly ties that relationship to production, right? How things are produced, to the way that society is organized, right? To be able to get to the kernel of that division, and to also look towards like the future of how that can be defeated. And like, yeah, it's like, I can't imagine for Rosa how frustrating it is to see somebody like Bernstein, somebody who comes up from this movement, basically replacing more scientific categories like capitalist and proletariat, capitalist and worker, with like this very, very kind of base rich versus poor,
Mhm.
which doesn't it's just it's very it's squishy as a political category. um and let's see, she um we'll get to the Blancas later in the thing, so we can come to that in a bit. She also knows, what is Bernstein's position on the decisive question of anarchy in the capitalist economy, right? Again, one of the fundamental criticisms of capitalism, from Marxists and socialists is that a lot of production and the way that things are produced, the way that things are organized in society, are anarchic, are chaotic, because that's the way that this system is set up, instead of something that is more rational and planned, right? You look at the way that capitalist firms sort of wage war upon each other, or in a more literal sense, wage war on other countries, right? Destroys productive capacity of other countries, creates a lot of damage, does a lot of economic damage, but it's in the interest of like certain sections of a capitalist class, right? To do so. Other things like competition creates a situation where you have to actually damage and weaken and break your economic opponents, right? Which creates crises in the capitalist system, right? It might be beneficial to a certain member of a capitalist class, but for capitalism as a system as a whole, it's extremely damaging, right? It's not a way that you want to govern a society. Going back to the text, Bernstein says he denies only the great general crisis. He does not deny partial and national crises. In other words, he refuses to see a great deal of the anarchy of capitalism. He sees only a little of it. He is, to use Marx's illustration, like the foolish virgin who had a child who is only very, very small, which is a pretty good.
It's always funny, like the jokes of like the 19th century getting repeated.
I mean, we had to throw that one in there just because I think that one actually made me laugh a good bit. I'm still a virgin. My baby's tiny, right? I think is a good way to sort of sum up some of the arguments here. She criticizes Bernstein's sort of departure from Marx's conception of social labor. Which I think is important, but I think in terms of like how we're going to get into the rest of the text, we might be able to sort of come back to that later. I mean, I think this is all sort of clamoring for us to sort of do like a Marxism 101 sometime in the future, Matt.
Mm.
Um, but let's see. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything really important in this first chapter before we move on to the other ones, which we're going to spend a lot more time on. Um, she also criticizes Bernstein's break with Marx, saying what precisely was the key which enabled Marx to open the door to the secret of the capitalist phenomenon and solve, as if in play, problems that were not even expected by the greatest minds of classic bourgeois economy. It was his conception of the capitalist economy as a historic phenomenon, not merely in the sense recognized in the best of cases by the classic economists, that is, when it concerns the feudal past of capitalism, but also insofar as it concerns the socialist future of the world. The secret of Marx's theory of value, of his analysis of the problem of money, of his theory of capital, of the theory of the rate of profit, and consequently of the entire existing economic system, is found in the transitory character of capitalist economy, the inevitability of its collapse leading, and this is the only other aspect of the same phenomenon, to socialism. It is only because Marx looked at capitalism from the socialist viewpoint that is from the historic viewpoint that he was enabled to decipher the hieroglyphics of the capitalist economy. And it is precisely because he took the socialist viewpoint as a part of departure for his analysis of bourgeois society that he was in the position to give a scientific base to the socialist movement. And like I think that this is really important is what she's saying here is that like Marx's ability to sort of recognize dialectically the transitory phase of capitalism, that the system as it exists is a historical um, phase of society, allows him to treat things differently from like a capitalist economist, which treats the market and the capital system as like an expression of rationality, of natural, of a natural system. And this is something Bernstein criticizes, calling it dualism. And I think she has a good response here where Rosa says, but what is Marx's dualism if not the dualism of the socialist future and the capitalist present? It is the dualism of capitalism and labor, the dualism of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It is a scientific reflection of the dualism existing in bourgeois society, the dualism of the class antagonism writhing inside the social order of capitalism. Bernstein's recognition of this theoretic dualism in Marx as a, quote, survival of utopianism is really his naive avowal that he denies the class antagonisms in capitalism. It is his confession that socialism has become for him only a survival of utopianism. What is Bernstein's monism, Bernstein's unity, but the internal unity of the capitalist regime, the unity of the former socialist who has renounced his aim and has decided to find in bourgeois society one and immutable the goal of human development. And again, for folks who haven't been following along with part one and part two, Bernstein's making these arguments that like financial capital is socializing capitalism, that large trust and coordinate and cartels are doing the work of socializing the system and have fixed the problem of capitalist crisis, right? Which again, you can look at it knowing what's just around the corner in Germany to see how wrong-headed that was. He makes the argument that, like, well, finance capital can sort of alleviate some of the crises in the business cycle. So capitalism has sort of developed a more social base to sort of prevent the dangers within the capital system. And as Rosa correctly points out, this financial system doesn't solve the problem. In
Mhm.
fact, it makes things even worse. And one of the best arguments that she makes here is that look at what happens when there is a kind of crisis in the business cycle in capitalism. What countries get hit the worst? It's the countries with the larger and more developed and more advanced financial systems that get hit worse. And a great example of this in contemporary times is look what country got wrecked by a particular crisis in the housing market, right? I'm talking about the 2007 financial crisis. A particular crisis in the housing market became a global crisis because of how financialized and how connected all these systems were. So Rosa makes the argument that, like, rather than Bernstein's argument that finance capital sort of fixed the problem, it
Yeah.
actually extends it to the entirety of this system, right? And I think, like, and when you sort of break down and break away from the kind of class character of capitalism, from like the understanding some of these movements as reflecting struggle between working people, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie, the people who owned capital and utilized that to extract value from other folks. I mean, yeah, you missed the entire heart and soul of socialism, not just like in a spiritual sense, but in a political one, where you're going to say goofy ass things like, "Oh, there's more shareholders now, so we've sort of broken out of capitalism and are looking towards a future of socialism."
Yeah, sort of it's a naive, sort of progressivism, basically, that, Bernstein has come across.
So, we sort of flew through that first chapter, but I think it'll be worth it so we can get into these other things, because this next one is the juicy one, right, Matt? Um,
Yeah, should we start listening to the opening to, this one here? We can get into
yeah,
some
we
of
could do that.
talks about the, contradictions in, co-ops and unions here.
Chapter 7: Cooperatives, Unions, Democracy. Bernstein's socialism offers to the workers the prospect of sharing in the wealth of society. The poor are to become rich. How will this socialism be brought about? His article in the Neue Zeit, Problems of Socialism, contain only vague allusions to this question. Adequate information, however, can be found in his book. Bernstein's socialism is to be realized with the aid of these two instruments: labor unions, or as Bernstein himself characterizes them, economic democracy, and cooperatives. The first will suppress industrial profit. The second will do away with commercial profit. Cooperatives, especially cooperatives in the field of production, constitute a hybrid form in the midst of capitalism. They can be described as small units of socialized production within capitalist exchange. But in capitalist economy, exchanges dominate production. As a result of competition, the complete domination of the process of production by the interests of capital, that is, pitiless exploitation, becomes a condition for the survival of each enterprise. The domination of capital over the process of production expresses itself in the following ways. Labor is intensified. The workday is lengthened or shortened, according to the situation of the market. And, depending on the requirements of the market, labor is either employed or thrown back into the street. In other words, use is made of all methods that enable an enterprise to stand up against its competitors in the market. The workers forming a cooperative in the field of production are thus faced with the contradictory necessity of governing themselves with the utmost absolutism. They are obliged to take toward themselves the role of capitalist entrepreneur, a contradiction that accounts for the usual failure of production cooperatives, which either become pure capitalist enterprises, or, if the workers' interests continue to predominate, end by dissolving.
Yeah. um I mean, that was a longer section, folks, but I think that actually like lays out the argument um really well. I mean, let's also just be clear that it's like, in a state and a status of, hyper exploitation for workers, like if that's something that you're able to organize and sort of ameliorate some of those conditions, it's not that it's necessarily like a bad thing,
Mhm.
to like work for cooperative. I just want to be clear so people don't misunderstand this argument, or
And
what
and also just because we are excerpting this, like I think Rose is pretty clear in this too. I mean, she
yeah.
I thought I was summarizing her novelly when I said she considers these defensive.
Yes.
But she literally explicitly says it in this section here.
But like, let's break down what she's saying here, because I think that this is something that a lot of people like might be scratching their heads about. What is she saying? So she is saying that cooperatives, because cooperatives are operating under a capitalist system and a capitalist market, that the idea that you have sort of broken away or broken out of the system is incorrect, right? Because you are still affected by the same crises in capitalism, right? So if there's a crisis of investment, right, that's going to be something that's going to affect your ability to produce. If other firms that you're competing with are ramping up their exploitation of workers and the amount of like socially necessary labor to produce a certain product, um, is um, going down, um, then your ability to sort of be able to hold and request like a high market price for your labor, because it's like, cruelty free, or whatever, is going to be extremely limited. So what you will be forced to do is to make decisions, either to make cuts to the benefits that you're providing workers, ramp up production, make people work longer hours, as I just said, like pay lower wages, um, or fail because you won't be able to compete with other firms. So the point is that um, it's capitalism is a system that is not just a system of the one-to-one relationship between a boss and a worker. There is an entire market that's attached to these things as well, right? There's a lot of things that are anarchic and sort of impose this logic and this will on the system of capitalism. So you're not going to be able to escape from it through like creating a cooperative labor system. And like, here's a great example of this. Mondragon, right, which is like the big co-op that people cite a lot during in the 2010s. They went through the same crises that all other capitalist firms were going into, and you know what they did? They cut wages for workers across the board, right? People voted for it because they wanted to make sure that like their firm survived. And the point here is saying that pressure that's coming from outside, that pressure that's coming from the capitalist system, is just as strong if you want to run your system. So yes, instead of it being an arbitrary way of doing so, like would happen under like a privately controlled firm, it's better, right? In
Yeah.
terms of the workers being able to decide, hey, we're going to take a collective wage cut versus CEO maintaining their pay or even increasing their pay while cutting their wages. Yes, it's different, but it doesn't escape and it doesn't break out of this crisis. So like there's been a lot of kind of novel ideas that basically what we need to do is create like a alternate like cooperative economy that competes with the capitalist economy, and eventually we'll have enough cooperatives that like it will, going with like the Bernstein argument from earlier in the book too, Matt, right? Like reach a tipping point, and then we'll be in like a socialized cooperative economy. It's not going to happen because you have to compete against private firms, and you also are sort of you're limited by the state of the market, by the general state of capitalism. So yes, I think that it's right to think about it like as you were just saying, and as Rosa says, like defensive, right? You can sort of like push back on some of like the worst personal examples of the system, but you're not breaking out of it. And on systemic level too, like I'm sorry, like I agree with Sam Gindin on this, that like I've always thought the idea that we're just going to build like an alternate economy and try to compete with the most brutal and willing to create harm and pain and suffering for people's system, you're going to lose that fight, right? And it's not the avenue that like as a movement, right, is going to be able to like provide the results on a personal level. On a small level, like you as a worker might be able to enjoy better conditions, and that's not something that anyone falsely for thinks is wrong-headed to
Mhm.
pursue. But as a tenet of like the socialist movement, as like a strategy about how we're going to end the system, it's not going to provide the same results. And it actually, if it were to be successful and be like representing a larger part of the economy, it creates a very weird dynamic where the worker is sort of split amongst themselves between their role basically as like an owner or manager of the corporation and as a worker, right? And you basically create workers who are in this position of sort of like aligning themselves with like the capitalist class in some way or the other, in the sense of like their response and reflexiveness to the whims of the market and like the capitalist economy as a whole.
Yeah, sort of all these things, both the co-ops, the trade unions, and democracy. It really is just like, yeah, there's still the fundamental conflict you have with capitalist domination of the economy.
And she says, she says right after that that Bernstein has noted this, but he doesn't understand it. Um, when he's looking at some of the criticisms of some cooperative models at the time that failed, he makes the argument that what the problem was that the workers weren't disciplined enough, right? So, like, the argument is we can break out of this system, but yet the workers aren't being brutal enough to themselves. I think, therefore, like that's Bernstein's argument for like why it's wrong to say, oh, these cooperatives failed. Rosa's saying that this is exactly the point: is that for these cooperatives to be successful, they have to be ruthless to themselves and to their coworkers and to the other members of the cooperative, right? And that's not a dynamic that is going to lead us to socialism or breaking out of capitalism. In fact, it puts us in this bizarre position of, one, being people who are suffering because we are sort of at the whims of the market, and two, also have to regulate and punish ourselves at the altar of, this larger global national system.
Yeah. Then, do you want to get into more of the trade union stuff, or should we get onto the democracy?
Um, is the union stuff right after this?
Yeah, I believe it is. I got a
Yeah, I mean,
section
because I think
here.
we come back. I mean, there's one more thing about cooperatives that I can just read really quick
Oh
here
yeah.
that I had highlighted. Within the framework of present society, producers' cooperatives are limited to the role of simple annexes to consumers' cooperatives. It appears, therefore, that the latter must be the beginning of the proposed social change. But this way, the expected reform of society by means of cooperatives ceases to be an offensive against capital production. That is, it ceases to be an attack against the principal basis of the capitalist economy. It becomes instead a struggle against commercial capital, especially small and middle sized commercial capital. It becomes an attack made on the twigs of the capitalist tree, right? And that's another point, too. It's like you're talking about the market. The market represents one form, one aspect of capital. So instead of sort of concentrating our focus and our energies and our activity on the entire system, it's, well, the consumers are the problem. We need to find ways to sort of beat back the consumers and force them to pay higher prices for consumer goods.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, I mean, is there anything else we want to say? I mean, I think cooperatives come up again later, but is there anything else we want to say before we move on to the union stuff?
No, I mean, I just feel like it's pretty. The problems they run into are very similar. And yeah, I mean, we have a section here where she summarizes what she said about unions in the previous sections, so we don't need to rehash that too much. But I think it's worth
Mhm.
playing a little bit.
The field of production. We have already shown that trade unions cannot give the workers a determining influence over production. Trade unions can determine neither the dimensions of production nor the technical progress of production. This much may be said about the purely economic side of the struggle of the rate of wages against the rate of profit, as Bernstein labels the activity of the trade union. It does not take place in the blue of the sky. It takes place within the well-defined framework of the law of wages. The law of wages is not shattered but applied by trade union activity.
Mhm.
According to Bernstein, it is the trade unions that lead in the general movement for the emancipation of the working class, the real attack against the rate of industrial profit. According to Bernstein, trade unions have the task of transforming the rate of industrial profit into rates of wages. The fact is that trade unions are least able to execute an economic offensive against profit. Trade unions are nothing more than the organized defense of labor power against the attacks of profit. They express the
Yeah, I mean, if you want to just jump in there, but that was like that seems to me like a proper understanding of it. And like, and that's not to say like unions or even co-ops couldn't be the site of like a political education that leads
Mhm.
like to a wider consciousness. That would necessitate much greater numbers than what we're seeing now. But I think as far as like, especially and as they've proven out over the last 100 years, I think that's fairly accurate summarization.
Yeah, no, I mean it is, and again, like you have to look at the long arm of history, and one of the arguments that Rosa is sort of getting at here is that like, and she will get to it later. She says it even more explicitly. It's not that like fighting for reforms in capitalism are bad. It's not that fighting for these defensive systems, right, like unions or even cooperatives, is inherently bad, but they're defensive. They're not offensive, and they're regulated by the same rules and logic of capitalism, right? It's still a
Mhm.
question of wages and profit, right? That's the logic of capitalism. And what these things can do is try to push and prevent these things from being expressed in their most brutal and nasty way. And that's good, right? Um, but in terms of being offensive weapons, they're limited. And this really, like, I think to understand this like from a socialist perspective, I think one of the ways to consider this, and it's something that's so unpopular these days, because we all like to be like decentralized and to just sort of be anarchic in our movements, but this is why like the party is something that's really important in socialist theory. And I think one of the best ways to sum this up, I apologize if I'm misattributing this, but I think it's Gindin, Sam Gindin, who says, the way you have to think about this is that the union and the trade union movement is the organization of the working class at the site of production, and the party is the organized form of the class at the level of society, at the level of politics, right? And it is that organization that has the ability to take on this system as a whole. Um, um and in this case, like in the US, it's tough, and we'll get to it later too, because she says like you have to develop these things, right? The argument here is not
Yeah.
do not develop the trade union movement, do not fight for some maybe sites where you can pull things or weaken some of the power of individual or even large scale capitalists, like in the form of like cooperatives, um, but rather that this has to be done in tandem with building this larger political movement, because that's the only thing that's going to be able to have that kind of final conflict with these things, because the unions and the cooperatives are still governed by the laws of capital and capitalism, and you can't break out of it with those systems alone. And yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that's really important, because like look, you people I'm sure who are watching this watch Left Reckoning. What do we do a lot on this program, Matt? We talk about how important it is to build up the trade union movement in this country. We talk about how
Mhm.
critical it is to support them and to fight for them and to see them expanded, right? Um, but it's with this general understanding that this is like one aspect of like the class struggle and the class fight. And what's become, I think, really dominant in the US left, at least, is sort of seeing that as like the end
Yeah.
of struggle. That's like the horizon, when we're talking about actually pushing even beyond that. And yeah, I mean, I think her arguments, and she has a whole chapter on this earlier in the piece too. So if you're only watching part 3, I think it's part 2 where we really spend a lot of time like hashing out these arguments. I mean, I think that her point is really important here, and this section is really focusing, I understand it, on like the political dimension, sort of seeing that like how Bernstein's replacement of like the socialist movement, with just sort of being participants in the trade union or supporting the cooperative movement, shows how he sort of evacuated any kind of attempt or hope for breaking out of the capital system, and just sort of be pushing with the more reformist wing of the capital political system.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good, like, let's move to this democracy section
Hmm.
in this chapter here. Let's play a little bit from Rosa.
Wait,
Oh,
Yep.
before we do, if you don't mind, there's
Mhm.
unless you were going to have this, is this where she talks about Sisyphus?
I believe so. Let me just do a quick search. Oh,
Yeah, let me.
no.
It's right here. It's
Yeah,
quick.
yeah,
I have it right in front of me. I'll read it really quick.
yeah. That is
In
good.
other words, the objective, in other words, the objective conditions of capitalist society transformed the two economic functions of the trade unions into a sort of labor Sisyphus, right? And people know that, the myth about being sort of condemned to pushing up a boulder up a hill, and then every time you get to the top of the hill, it rolls back down. Um, um, Capitalist society transforms the two economic functions of the trade unions into a sort of labor of Sisyphus, which is nevertheless indispensable. For
Mhm.
as a result of the activity of his trade unions, the worker succeeds in obtaining for himself the rate of wages due to him in accordance with the situation of the labor power market. As a result of trade union activity, the capitalist law of wages is applied, and the effect of the depressing tendency of economic development is paralyzed, or to be more exact, attenuated. However, the transformation of the trade union movement into an instrument for the progressive reduction of profit in favor of wages presupposes the following social conditions. First, the cessation of the proletarianization of the middle strata of our society, and secondly, a stoppage of the growth of productivity of labor. We have in both cases a return to pre-capitalist conditions. Um, so I think that that's like like also like a really important addendum, to what she's saying here is that, you can sort of push back against this logic, but even if it was successful, in fact, we're returning not to socialism, like we're not moving towards socialism, but trying to move back to maybe like a more guild style of production, a more pre-capital style of production, and that's not something that's going to be happening on the national international scale.
Right.
Yeah, but now we can get to democracy, I think, if you're good.
Yeah, let's do it.
only displacement. He considers them accidental, momentary, and suggests that they are not to be considered in the elaboration of the general directives of the labor movement. To Bernstein, democracy is an inevitable stage in the development of society. To him, as to the bourgeois theoreticians of liberalism, democracy is the great fundamental law of historic development, the realization of which is served by all the forces of political life. However, Bernstein's thesis is completely false. Presented in this absolute force, it appears as a petty bourgeois vulgarization of the results of a very short phase of bourgeois development, the last 25 or 30 years. We reach entirely different conclusions when we examine the historic development of democracy a little closer and consider at the same time the general political history of capitalism.
Again, like a lot of what she says here, it could just be someone you talk with like Vincent Bevins about the Jakarta method or
Yeah.
things like that. Like yeah, this sort of idea that you would this sort of like I don't know, rose tinted view you get from television of like, oh yes, look at like the march of democracy and
Hmm.
like fucking the Iraq War, we're going there to spread democracy, right? And it's like you kick the tires on that a little bit, and it would be nice, but that's not really what is going on in the world.
And we'll get to it more explicitly in the text in just a second. But like Rosa, I think correctly makes the argument that this idea that like capitalism and democracy are somehow sort of born together and are wedded together is false. And like I
Mhm.
don't know, you don't have to look too far into history to see one how you know in the early stages, the expansion of democracy was really an expression of the rising bourgeois class. Like the class that we know as a ruling class now was not the historical ruling class, and
Yeah.
democracy was something that they touched on for some people, right? And this is the thing: is like whenever people talk about like America or like these things, like oh well, it wasn't a democracy for all these people. It's like yeah, because it was an expression of class power and class development. There were people who were trying to push it further and recognize like these kind of kernels, like people like Thomas Paine.
Right.
But the reason these things won is because it had a rising class um, behind it. And, this is a kind of argument that you hear. Like, this is like a Washington, D.C., like dinner club argument, right? This is a TED Talk kind of
Yeah.
thing, is that like democracy and capitalism are sort of aligned, and they develop. And as capitalism develops, so does democracy. And as Rose will argue later, you can see very quickly that whenever there's crisis, or whenever the bourgeois or the ruling class doesn't need democracy, they're like, hands up,
Yeah.
we're going to roll this thing back. And I think in the US, if you want to, have rosy eyed things, it's like, well, once we were a democracy, now we're not. Well, that's an argument, for example, about, some of the limitation. Like, there's a lot of things that we don't get to decide in this society that are outside of politics,
Yes.
namely, private ownership of the means of production and things like that.
Yeah.
But she has like this good historic argument here.
Yeah.
um, uh, Democracy has been found in the most dissimilar social formations, in primitive communist groups, in the slave states of antiquity, and in medieval communes. And similarly, absolutism and constitutional monarchy are to be found under the most varied economic orders. When capitalism began, with the first production of commodities, it resorted to a democratic constitution in the municipal communes of the Middle Ages. Later, when it developed to manufacturing, capitalism found its corresponding political form in the absolute monarchy. Finally, as the developed industrial economy, it brought into being in France the Democratic Republic of 1793, the absolute monarchy of Napoleon I, the nobles' monarchy of the Restoration period, 1830 to 1850, the bourgeois constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe, then again the Democratic Republic, and against the monarchy of Napoleon III, and finally, for the third time, the Republic. And look, you can you can do that in many, many different contexts and countries. And the point that she's making is this
Hmm.
idea that these things are connected. Well, actually, it is that they're connected, but the idea that they're connected in this kind of long march of progressive and more democratic history is wrong, because like certain
Yeah.
forms
They're
benefit
not
certain. Yeah.
they're not partners. Like
Yeah.
democracy was a tool, and fucking capitalism will get rid of that tool the second it doesn't need it anymore.
And I mean, like, look, plenty of modern examples of very powerful capitalist forces in the global system now that are nowhere close to a monarchy. I mean, think about something like Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
um, America, right? Like, there's plenty of examples of these things not going hand in hand, like the most rose tinted folks do. And it's funny because, like, sometimes you can forget in this text that she's talking about, again, like a so-called like socialist who's making these arguments that today, in the modern context, the people who make these arguments tend to be libertarian or neoliberal apologists for the system. But I think I have this marked in red. So
Hmm.
let me get this really quick. She says later, the uninterrupted victory of democracy, which to our revisionism as well as to bourgeois liberalism appears as a great fundamental law of human
Yeah.
history and a special modern history, is shown upon closer examination to be a phantom. No absolute and general relation can be constructed between capitalist development and democracy. The political form of a given country is always the result of the composite of all of the existing political factors, domestic as well as foreign. It admits within its limits all variations of the scale from absolute monarchy to the democratic republic. Mm. You know, a Jakarta method is like, you want to read the like that book apply. I mean, sorry, you want to read that argument like applied to like the recent history, like the Jakarta method is like the one to jump into, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or even just neoliberalism as like the removal of especially economic decision making from any sort of like a publicly sort of responsive governing body or electorally particularly like it's all corporate decisions making now and then yeah like I mean not to go back to it but the return to more anarchy in that system too as they basically become lawless.
Yeah. No. I mean, the and try not to bog us down with too much of the history. Again, like people, these should be, something that we attach to reading the text if you want the best understanding. Um, but she has this, which I think, really highlights, I think, the tension. If liberalism as such is now absolutely useless to bourgeois society, it has become, on the other hand, a direct impediment to capitalism from other
Mm.
standpoints. Two factors dominate completely the political life of the contemporary state: world politics and the labor movement. Each is only a different aspect of the present phase of capitalist development. As a result of the development of the world economy and the aggravation and generalization of competition on the world market, militarism and the policy of big navies have become, as instruments of world politics, the decisive factor in the interior as well as in the exterior life of the great states. If it is true that world politics and militarism represent a rising tendency in the present phase of capitalism, then bourgeois democracy must logically move in a descending line. And writing's on the wall here.
Yeah.
It's dark when you think, and remember that we're about to go through horrific global conflict, and the eradication of the limited democracy that people enjoyed at that time, in many countries, in the world. Right? She's recognizing that rather than this long triumphant march of capitalism and liberal democracy, oh Lord, those systems are about to come in conflict with each other in a big way.
Yeah. I mean, where I mean, I guess there's certain parts of the world, South America, maybe you could make a point that like we're getting some democracy, but other places like India, for instance, or whatever, like maybe not making the strides that Bernstein would have hoped at this
No,
point.
I don't think so. Um, well, to end this chapter, I think her last section here is worth just going through.
Mhm.
Talking about Bernstein, he proves at the same time still another thing by making the denouncement of the socialist aim an essential condition of the resurrection of bourgeois democracy. He shows how inexact is the claim that bourgeois democracy is an indispensable condition of the socialist movement and the victory of socialism. Bernstein's reasoning exhausts itself in a vicious circle. His conclusion swallows his premises. The solution is quite simple. In view of the fact that bourgeois liberalism has given up its ghost from fear of the growing labor movement and its final aim, we conclude that the socialist labor movement is today the only support for that which is not the goal, of the socialist movement: democracy. We must conclude that democracy can have no support. We, sorry, we must conclude that democracy can have no support. We must conclude that the socialist movement is not bound to bourgeois democracy, but that, on the contrary, the fate of democracy is bound up with the socialist movement. We must conclude that from this, that democracy does not acquire greater chances of survival as the socialist movement becomes sufficiently strong to struggle against the reactionary consequences of world politics and the bourgeois desertion of democracy. He who would strengthen democracy should want to strengthen and not weaken the socialist movement. He who renounces the struggle for socialism renounces both the labor movement, and the movement for democracy. And like, I know that's a lot of words. What she's saying there is, if you want to support democracy and if you want to support the labor movement, the only thing to support is the socialist movement here, because both of those things are under threat by the reformists, by capitalism, and by rejecting the socialist movement and its aims to fundamentally transform society. You're setting yourself up for a lot of those things to be rolled back. And look, again, can give some people credit? They're trying to understand the world at their time. Talk about Bernstein. Um, Man, what happens to democracy? What happens to the labor movement over the course of the next century, in Germany, in the United States, in England, all across, across the Western world? Her argument there is completely borne out, that it was this rejection of the socialist movement by certain tendencies in the trade union movement. It was this rejection of the socialist movement by members of the more reformist camps, that ends up seeing democracy be um, stifled, and the union movement be stifled, because the only force that is willing to sort of stand up and challenge the direct power imbalances that lead to that threaten these things, that fundamentally threaten these things, were the socialists, the people who were recognizing that it is like the capitalist class and the interests of capital that are the biggest threats to democracy and the labor movement, and not the the socialists, the people who were trying to fight for them.
Yeah. Well, I think, are we ready for the maybe the most like the culminating chapter? I mean, there's two more after this, but
Yeah,
chapter 8, the conquest of political power. I feel like maybe we just want to take this one from the top for a little bit because
that
it,
sounds good.
yeah.
Chapter 8: Conquest of Political Power. The fate of democracy is bound up, we have seen, with the fate of the labor movement. But does the development of democracy render superfluous or impossible a proletarian revolution, that is, the conquest of political power by the workers? Bernstein settles the question by weighing minutely the good and bad sides of social reform and social revolution. He does it almost in the same manner in which cinnamon or pepper is weighed out in a consumer's cooperative store. He sees the legislative course of historic development as the action of intelligence, while the revolutionary course of historic development is for him the act of feeling.
That's a very 19th century shit right there. Why would those two be the I don't know, whatever.
Reformist activity he recognizes as a slow method of historic progress, revolution as a rapid method of progress. In legislation, he sees a methodical force. In revolution, a spontaneous force. We have known for a long time that the petty bourgeoisie reformer finds good and bad sides in everything. He nibbles a bit at all grasses. But the real course of events is little affected by such combination. The carefully gathered little pile of the good sides of all things possible collapses at the first fillip of history. Historically, legislative reform and the revolutionary method function in accordance with influences that are much more profound than the consideration of the advantages or inconveniences of one method or another.
And I think this is where she really starts spitting
Yeah.
on this whole the title of her book here.
In the history of bourgeois society, legislative reform served to strengthen progressively the rising class, till the latter was sufficiently strong to seize political power, to suppress the existing juridical system, and to construct itself a new one. Bernstein, thundering against the conquest of political power as a theory of Blanquist violence, has the misfortune of labeling as a Blanquist error that which has always been the pivot and the motive force of human history.
Now, just sorry to cut her off there. We can go back a little bit, but when she talks about him, railing against it as a form of Blancist violence, is that similar to Jonathan Chait or centrists saying, "Oh, what you believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat?" Then, that sort of concern trolling.
I mean, I think more so that it's like a reflection of um, like a push, an attempt by a very very small minority to be able to seize power spontaneously,
Right.
without having the capacity or the ability to basically be able to govern, and just creates crisis because you're just sort of seizing at a kind of opportunity, right? It's like unplanned, anarchic, conspiratorial kind of stuff. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat is certainly something that Bernstein's rejecting too, throughout the
Yeah.
piece.
And we do get to later in this section Bernstein on the sort of they're not prepared to rule, and I like Rosa's point, yeah, that's gonna happen the first few times probably.
Yeah, I love
You're
that.
gonna need to
That's
work
actually
through that.
honestly so good.
Yeah. But let's continue with this a little bit more.
From the first appearance of class societies having the class struggle as the essential content of their history, the conquest of political power has been the aim of all rising classes. Here is the starting point and end of every historic period. This can be seen in the long struggle of the Latin peasantry against the financiers and nobility of ancient Rome, in the struggle of the medieval nobility against the bishops, and in the struggle of the artisans against the nobles, in the cities of the Middle Ages. In modern times, we see it in the struggle of the bourgeoisie against feudalism. Legislative reform and revolution are not different methods of historic development that can be picked out at the pleasure from the counter of history, just as one chooses hot or cold sausages.
I mean, that is hilarious. I like the imagination. It's cinnamon at the co-op store and hot and cold sausages. Very
At the
super
Revolution
thought.
store.
That can be picked out at the pleasure.
Yeah.
Revolution is the
You had something?
No.
just as one chooses hot or cold sausages. Legislative reform and revolution are different factors in the development of class society. They condition and complement each other, and are, at the same time, reciprocally exclusive, as are the North and South poles, the bourgeoisie and proletariat. Every legal constitution is the product of a revolution. In the history of classes, revolution is the act of political creation, while legislation is the political expression of the life of a society that has already come into being. Work for reform does not contain its own force independent from revolution. During every historic period, work for reforms is carried on only in the direction given to it by the impetus of the last revolution, and continues as long as the impulsion from the last revolution continues to make itself felt. Or, to put it more concretely, in each historic period, work for reforms is carried on only in the framework of the social form, created by the last revolution. Here is the
You want to maybe pause there? I mean,
Yeah.
this sort of understanding of revolutions, like for instance, like the American Revolution, is such a more like adult one than a sort of like the sort of moralistic one that people say that is being had by the left, for instance. But like, yeah, it was a revolution against a sort of feudal order by a class of capitalists, and like there are advancements to be made in that, and then
Huge.
there's
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
In the sense of like personal and individual liberties and things like that, and also in like, I mean, going on, from what she's saying here is that like, um um where's the direct quote? um Work for reforms is carried out in the direction given to it by the impetus of the last revolution continues as long as the implosion from the last revolutions continues to make itself felt. The Civil War is like a direct example of this, right? Like some of the like the logic and the ideas, the fundamental contradiction of American society from its founding,
Yeah.
to the Civil Wars. Like, how can you have people in bondage in a society that all people are equal and all people are free? That expresses itself in the character, which is why I think it's important not to, like, for example, like some people have fallen into this trap of like treating like the American Revolution as like quote unquote like reactionary, when in general
Mhm.
sense, like, it was tremendously progressive, and you see that call being answered throughout American history, right? Of, like, some of like the founding, it's limited. Like the American Revolution, I don't think um you know sets us up with like the kernels of like socialism, but in terms of like realizing a more democratic society, where like the ability of people to like literally own folks, that kernel is in the American Revolution undoubtedly, right? You had some of the you know you basically spend the early bit of American history trying to excuse and run away from like something like a child could understand the
Right.
fundamental contradictions of that revolution. But it is because of that revolution that those things are able to be challenged. And I totally agree. Like, I think this is a way more mature way to think about like reform and revolution, is that like, um rather than like revolution being seen as like, I love the argument that she's saying here about like, the like the revolution is sort of a quick like spurt of like spontaneity, and she's like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
It represents like long held and long boiling over contradictions and conflicts within a society. um
And
and
and a different class victor, right? Like, isn't that a key
yeah,
ingredient for a revolution? Like, you don't just have like, oh, we did a revolution-y type thing, and now capitalists and workers are partners,
yeah,
right? Which is that'd be the first time in all this string of revolutions, right? Like she goes through the line of you got the bourgeois overthrowing the kings overthrowing the like sort of religious orders, right? Like there has to be a different class victor, and it's not like a new partnership of the classes coming out of it.
and
Really, I
and
mean, I guess maybe sort of is.
And remember, like, revolution also goes like both ways, in the sense of like revanchist movements, right?
Right.
Reactionary movements are also the reflection of a certain class trying to dominate over another class, like an expression of their power. So one, like, revolutions that we might consider to be reactionary, and rightfully so, are also the same kind of like expression of class power, right? This is why when she's going through like the history of like the French revolutions, she's saying like, different groups were benefiting from these shifts in power and these shifts in this general system. And like, I just think that this is like, even beyond, going against like Bernstein and other folks, people, who, just the challenge here is, recognizing that certain activities, can the activities that are possible are limited by the structure that you're in, right? And like, you can do things like, quote unquote, with reforms that are good and actually like increase, and benefit, the rising class, right? These are things that you see in like the feudal system, where certain rights and privileges are extended to the rising bourgeoisie, right? And this is sort of the argument about why it's worthwhile to, support and try to build up a stronger labor movement, and win certain kinds of reforms and concessions. Where this criticism, where the heart of this debate, I think, between like, quote unquote, like reform and revolution, is where people like Bernstein and revisionists within the socialist movement start to only see the reforms as the thing that is as possible, and also try to trick themselves into thinking that things that, will not be touched by reform, are going to be like reformable under the current kind of, um, constraints. And I don't even want to, go any further, because she's going to talk in a second about one of the things that makes reform under capitalism to the productive system that we have, um, frankly, impossible.
Yeah, let's
Uh,
continue. Should we keep playing a little bit, or do you want to skip ahead?
I think I have some stuff a little bit later, so it might be worth skipping ahead. And if
Cool.
we catch up to each other, we can start playing again. I love this line. Just wanted to up it again. A social transformation and a legislative reform do not differ according to their duration, but according to their content. The secret of historic change through the utilization of political power resides precisely in the transformation of simple quantitative modification into a new quality, or to speak more concretely, into a passage of a historic period from one given form of society to another. This is why people who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform in place and in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and social revolution, do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they take a stand for surface modifications of the old society. And skipping down just a little bit, our program becomes not the realization of socialism. They're talking about if the reformists win out. Our program becomes not the realization of socialism, but the reform of capitalism, not the suppression of the wage labor system, but the diminution of exploitation. That is the suppression of the abuses of capitalism instead of the suppression of capitalism itself. Um, and I think, from the arguments that Bernstein is making, it's very clear that that's where that's going. Um, but going on, a little bit further, and I don't know if you have this sort of clocked out, but I can read it if not.
Mhm.
One paragraph later, she goes, "What distinguishes bourgeois society from other class societies, from ancient society, and from the social order of the Middle Ages? Precisely the fact that class domination does not rest on, quote, acquired rights, but on real economic relations. The fact that wage labor is not a juridical relation, but purely an economic relation. In our juridical system, there is not, a single legal formula for the class domination of today. The few remaining traces of such formula of class domination are, as that concerning servants, survivals of feudal society." And what she's saying here, um, is that what is like unique, what is particular about this certain historical moment that we're in, um, is that the economic order, that the exploitation that is baked into the system is not like in the Constitution, right? It's not. We will have a system of like waged labor, and we will have two classes, but are rather sort of portrayed to us as real economic relations, the rational moving of economic activity. And this is like a fundamental aspect of like democratic, like liberal capitalism, is that these things aren't lined out in the same way, that like there is no law, to be overturned in capitalism, in the capitalist economy, in a capitalist society, to quote unquote like end the capitalist system. It doesn't operate in that kind of way, and it's a very important, shift. Um, I'm curious what you think, Matt, in terms of content here, because she has a pretty long, but interesting breakdown of some of the transitions from feudal society. Do you think we should play that, or should we? Um,
Yeah, I got this section here, and if you want to add something to it, but this is on democracy as uh, she says indispensable.
mhm.
We'll play a little bit of this here.
Placing all these obstacles in the way of socialism. But capitalism furnishes, besides the obstacles, also the only possibilities of realizing the socialist program. The same can be said about democracy. If democracy has become superfluous or annoying to the bourgeoisie, it is on the contrary necessary and indispensable to the working class. It is necessary to the working class because it creates political forms, autonomous administration, electoral rights, etc., which will serve the proletariat as fulcrums in its task of transforming bourgeois society. Democracy is indispensable to the working class because only through the exercise of its democratic rights in the struggle for democracy can the proletariat become aware of its class interests and its historic task. In a word, democracy is indispensable, not because it renders superfluous the conquest of political power by the proletariat, but because it renders this conquest of power both necessary and possible. When Engels, in his preface to the class struggles in France, revised the tactics of the modern labor movement and urged the legal struggle as opposed to the barricades, he did not have in mind, this comes out of every line of the preface.
And I just want to stop there. We talked about that
Yeah.
preference at the start of the second episode, and you'll want to go back to that because that preface was very self-censored to avoid legal trouble for the party by
Hmm.
Engels. So I just want to say that there. But I think that point, and yeah, if you want to say more on this, but like the sort of like the naive faith in what democracy can bring as just like, oh, it's here, it's going to march across the world. Like that is a huge problem, and
Hmm.
it's a huge illusion people need to wake up from. Nonetheless, like that sort the forms that it can help folks sort of recognize and put to use, I think is nonetheless like extremely valuable.
Yeah, I mean, and this is like the point too. Just like in similar ways to what she says about cooperatives and trade unions, it's not the rejection of these things as such, but a recognition of the need for more. And like, um, I think the um, the bit about Engels, I think, is really important too, because it's something that's always cited, and I think it's important to remember that, like, yeah, these were self censored, because as that point continues. Um, he's talking about like the certain conditions in France and the certain opportunities that are available for the class movement and things that they should be doing. But you have to be able to think dialectically about these things, right?
Mhm.
To understand that reform is not revolution. But also reform is not something that should be outright rejected. And you fall into two like problems I find on the left, right? There's like the reformists who basically say we're going to foreclose like the horizon of a socialist future and just pursue reforms. And then there's a second function where people don't recognize, they say like, oh, it only has to be and it only can be, through revolutionary or like insurrectionary activities that things can be achieved. And that's incorrect. And Rosa's saying that like, um, the goal, instead of even thinking about those two things, the goal should be how can we get working class people in power and what steps are necessary to bring us to that situation. And the most of the debates that you get from people like, are you a reformist or are you a revolutionary, almost always ignored like that fundamental tactical question, right?
Yeah.
As to like how in practice, right? Not which one you prefer, which one like seems more fun to you or exciting or interesting or respectable, but what things are in front of us right now that we can utilize to increase and benefit the working class, right? Understanding that reforms are a dead end, there's a limit to what they can do, but also recognizing that it's very important to build up the power in society of the working class, because you can't go into a revolutionary struggle if you don't have a class, right? If you don't have a class consciousness, if you don't
Yeah.
have an organization, if you don't have the capability or the capacity to be able to wield power, let alone take it, then you're going to set yourself up, for losses, not just
And
failures, losses, which is a different
and
thing from trying and failing. Losing is something that's very, very different.
yeah, and like I think that's like the way she describes the like sort of the bourgeois class reforms leading it to its own power and ultimately ability to just overcome the feudal order. Um, do we want to move to the section on Bernstein's warning against the proletariat getting power too early?
Before we get there, let's just do one quick
Mhm.
section. This next section here. Marx's well-known sentence on the agrarian question in England. Bernstein leans on it heavily, in which he says, quote, "We shall probably succeed easier by buying the estates of the landlords." Does not refer, and I've heard this one a lot,
Right.
does not refer to the stand of the proletariat before, but after its victory. For there evidently can be a question of buying the property of the old dominant classes only when the workers are in power. The possibility envisioned by Marx is that of pacific exercise of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and not the replacement of the dictatorship with capitalist social reforms. There was no doubt for Marx and Engels about the necessity of having the proletariat conquer political power. It is left to Bernstein to consider the poultry yard of bourgeois parliamentarism as the organ by means of which we are to realize the most formidable transformation of history, the passage from capitalist society to socialism. And I just think that that's like an important addendum to that section, is like how there's like, like Marx or even Engels, talking about some strategies in terms of like how these things should be put into place or practiced, with an idea that you're going to be able to do that without sort of being in power, right? So Marx is saying, yeah, like when a revolutionary socialist government comes into power, like maybe they should buy out the
Yeah.
capitalist movement, like a counter revolution. Is very, very different from saying basically we're going to just beg and plead and hope that they'll let us take the shit that they use to live very nice lives. Is wrong. You have to have the ability to to make them make that choice between getting paid or not getting paid, right? The question about whether or not their property is going to be expropriated is not the question that is being asked to the capitalist class in that Marx vision there. It's how you're going to do it, which again, like that, those are two very, very different things. And as she says, you're not going to get there from the poultry yard of parliamentarianism.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
Yeah, we
Here's
can go
just
on to the next bit.
the section two, which I think is very like because I do yeah. Well, we'll just play it.
Transformation of history. The passage from capitalist society to socialism. Bernstein introduces his theory by warning the proletariat against the danger of acquiring power too early. That is, according to Bernstein, the proletariat ought to leave the bourgeois society in its present condition and itself suffer a frightful defeat. If the proletariat came to power, it could draw from Bernstein's theory the following practical conclusion: to go to sleep. His theory condemns the proletariat at the most decisive moments of the struggle, to inactivity, to a passive betrayal of its own cause. Our program would be a miserable scrap of paper if it could not serve us in all eventualities, at all moments of the struggle, and if it did not serve us by its application and not by its non-application. If our program contains the formula of the historical development of society from capitalism to socialism, it must also formulate, in all its characteristic fundamentals, all the transitory phases of this development, and it should, consequently, be able to indicate to the proletariat what ought to be its corresponding action at every moment on the road towards socialism. There can be no time for the proletariat when it will be obligated to abandon its program or be abandoned by it. Practically, this is manifested in the fact that there can be no time when the proletariat, placed in power by the force of events, is not in the condition, or is not morally obliged, to take certain measures for the realization of its program. That is, take transitory measures in the direction of socialism. Behind the belief that the socialist program can collapse completely at any point of the dictatorship of the proletariat lurks the other belief that the socialist program is generally, and at all times, unrealizable. And what if the transitory measures are premature? The question hides a great number of mistaken ideas concerning the real course of a social transformation. In the first place, the seizure of political power by the proletariat, that is to say, by a large popular class, is not produced artificially. It presupposes, with the exception of such cases as the Paris Commune, when the proletariat did not obtain power after a conscious struggle for its goal, but fell into its hands like a good thing abandoned by everybody else, a definite degree of maturity of economic and political relations. Here, we have the essential difference between coups d'état, along Blanqui's conception, which are accomplished by an active minority.
Again, just to jump in, like this is the Blanquist, like sort of coup, which is what I think Bernstein accuses his opponents of wanting, and Rosa points out why, like, actually that's not what they're proposing at all.
And burst out like pistol shot, always inopportunely, and the conquest of political power by a great conscious popular mass, which can only be the product of the decomposition of bourgeois society, and therefore bears in itself the economic and political legitimization of its opportune appearance. If, therefore, considered from the angle of political effect, the conquest of political power by the working class cannot materialize itself too early, then for the angle of conservation of power, the premature revolution, the thought of which keeps Bernstein awake, menaces us like a sword of Damocles. Against that neither prayers nor supplication, neither scares nor any amount of anguish are of any avail, and this for two very simple reasons. In the first place, it is impossible.
Oops.
I mean, I just think it's worth like jumping in here because I think we should just see this section out because all these paragraphs ahead are I think critical to the argument. But
Right.
The idea here that like you're going to be able to like the conflation, for example, of like an insurrection of like a small minority of people, I think is something that Bernstein is accusing the radicals and the revolutionaries within the social democratic movement of doing. But it's actually like, sometimes when like you make enough criticism of something, right? Sometimes people who are proponents of it actually like absorb those criticisms and sort of say like why that's a good thing. You see that a lot on the left, that like basically what we need is like small activity by like a small few to sort of like wake people up, and then we'll be able to take power. Like this is like a fantasy that has been on the left for a long time. And it's very popular in America. And I think particularly because of like the weakness of like the labor movement, the working class movement in this country over the past 100 years, that it's easier for people to actually like envision like a coup d'etat, right, against like the American state than it is to imagine like a powerful organized mass movement of workers in this country.
Yeah, and I mean, you could kind of see this in the Bernie versus like Hillary thing, where you like wanted like where, and Bernie didn't have this. Like Bernie, this is why he talked about the movement and all the work that would happen after he, would win sort of victory in a primary or such, or in a general even. But like because I don't like he thought like even, oh yeah, I'll get my team in there and then we're gonna figure out how to do socialism.
Yeah.
Like no, that would actually just be one step, and a educational one, and probably a fucking difficult one. I mean, it'd be better than Trump, but like that would have probably been a very difficult learning experience for the left.
So this next bit here, she says, in the first place, it is impossible to imagine that a transformation as formidable as the passage from capital society to social society can be realized in one happy act. To consider that as possible is again to lend color to conceptions that are clearly Blancist. The socialist transformation supposes a long and stubborn struggle, in the course of which it is quite probable the proletariat will be repulsed more than once, so that for the first time, from the viewpoint of the final outcome of the struggle, it will have necessarily come to power too early, right? And I think that is another phenomenal bit here. And Let me just add the second point here before we comment on it. In the second place, it will be impossible to avoid the quote premature conquest of state power by the proletariat, precisely because these premature attacks on the proletariat constitute a factor, and indeed a very important factor, creating the political conditions of the final victory. In the course of the political crisis accompanying its seizure of power, in the course of the long and stubborn struggles, the proletariat will acquire the degree of political maturity permitting it to obtain in time a definitive victory of the revolution. Thus, these premature attacks of the proletariat against the state power are in themselves important historic factors, helping to provoke and determine the point of the definite victory. Considered from this viewpoint, the idea of a premature conquest of political power by the laboring class appears to be a polemic absurdity derived from a mechanical conception of the development of society and positing for the victory of the class struggle a point fixed outside and independent of the class struggle. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot in there, and like, not to turn my guns inward, but like this is something too where like you see people sort of like expecting there to be like one final struggle and one like grand moment, and historical victory. And I think she's correct in saying this is a long struggle, and like people get really upset when you say that. But Marx said that. This is like throughout Marxist theory, is that like, just like, for example, like even just like getting the position of like entering the state is only the beginning of these kind of struggles. So like, another example too is like when you see socialist movements be successful in like achieving state power and sort of expecting them to from then on out sort of be able to operate in like a thoroughly and solidly socialist economic model, or even just like correct, right, without like issues and crises and problems, is like a kind of wrong-headed fantasy that I think a lot of people have sort of inherited. Understanding that these things are going to be long struggles. If it's a problem for the reformers in the sense that like they're saying, oh, it's too early, we can't touch this kind of thing. It was also, unfortunately, a massive theoretic error of, like, for example, the Soviet Union, right? Like under Stalin, the idea that are you losing me, Matt? Um, under Stalin, the idea that we're going to have socialism in one country and sort of like abandon the socialist movement in other countries. Oftentimes, the argument was those countries or those movements aren't at this sort of moment of political and economic development, right?
Mm.
So it can't happen there. So we like won't participate because it's going to happen too early, and then we're going to lose, right? Well, you end up seeing what happens is like isolation for this historic moment. And instead of like Lenin's argument that like we're going to attack capitalism as weakest chain, it ends up being that the weakest chain is like for a long time the only one. Um, which is why like I always like remind folks that there's a reason that like Lenin in particular was popular in like anti-colonial struggles, because while certain members of like the kind of Marxist intellectual class would say like, oh, this country's too backwards to have like a successful revolution, Lenin was somebody who, like, in the context of Russia, right, Russia was the most backward, like it's not going to happen in Russia, it's going to have to happen in Germany or in England or France. Lenin's like, well, we will make those conditions, right? And she's getting at this throughout the whole thing. It's like, we have theory, right? But it is going to have to be reflected in like the present material conditions of the world that we're in. And if we have a theory, if we have a program that is only applicable in a certain kind of like given from the heavens moment, it's a dead letter. It's a dead program. And unfortunately, both from like the reformists who say like, well, these things aren't sort of, lining up in this way, or in the case of Bernstein saying like, well, actually capitalism is becoming radical and revolutionary, all the way to like the Stalinists who basically foreclosed like revolutionary activity. This hardening of this theory, instead of it having it being something that's reflective of the different conditions, historical and political moments in different nations and in different levels of development, is a huge loss for the socialist movement in the 19th century, in the 20th century.
Yeah. You read that part about this. It's presupposes a long struggle, right? Or did I just?
No, yeah, we just read that.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
The last bit that we have in front of us is the last paragraph where she says, Since the proletariat is not in the position to seize power in any other way than prematurely, since the proletariat is absolutely obliged to seize power once or several times too early before it can maintain itself in power for good, the objection to the premature conquest of power is at bottom nothing more than a general opposition to the aspiration of the proletariat to possess itself of state power. Just as all roads lead to Rome, so too do we logically arrive at the conclusion that the revisionist proposal to slight the final aim of the socialist movement is really a recommendation to renounce the socialist movement itself.
Yeah, and that's a real, like, again, looking back at history of, let's say, bourgeois capitalist class versus feudalism, like that happened a number of times too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the English Civil War, there was the Protectorate, and then the Restoration a decade later with more rights for the capitalists, and then there was another one, and like, this is throughout different, and that's just in England. But yeah, like that is it's like they were allowed to seize power a number of times too early,
Yeah.
and it worked out for them.
No, I think it's it's a really, I think, important moment. Like, look, again, like this is something that's going to happen in Rose's life, after this,
Mm.
is that there is like an attempt to sort of take over the state before there was a capacity, and Rosa ends up getting murdered by the Social Democrats. Um, for her participation in that. But like she also didn't think that they had the capacity or the ability to achieve what was sort of being set out then. But as a good comrade, she wasn't somebody who was going to back down from
Mhm.
this fight. So it's not the argument, though. Just want to be really clear. It's not the argument that basically what like have a revolution under like any conditions, but rather that once you start to reject and say, well, things aren't ready, and you're not trying to build for things to be ready, then you've basically turned your back on the conception of building a socialist movement, which is like the trap of reformism, right? Reformism says we want these things, but also we shouldn't try to build up the movement that is capable of doing these things, and also privileges one kind of activity at the exclusion of the other. So I know we've gone on a little long, but we're almost at the end. I think these last couple of chapters are probably best to be read, folks, because she's really wrapping up the argument. And while this is like a very rich theoretical text, it's also, don't forget, its first function is to destroy Bernstein and these arguments that they're making. So um, I think we can sort of roll through 9 and 10 sort of quickly, and then maybe
Yeah.
come back with their final thoughts. I mean, really, for 9, what she's arguing against is stuff that she sort of outlined throughout this text, is Bernstein's rejection of the collapse, that the crisis theory of capitalism, and is proposing a cooperation that cannot exist without capitalism. Um, she says, in a class society, the class struggle is a natural and unavoidable phenomenon. Bernstein, therefore, contests even the existence of classes in society. The working class is for him a mass of individuals divided politically and intellectually, but also economically, right? This is like liberalism 101, right? There isn't a class, right? This is like why we on this program talk about this red state, blue state thing when it comes to analyzing working class voters is a huge distraction, right? Because that's the thesis there, is that there is no working class. There's a bunch of different people experiencing different things. Um, uh, um, the bourgeoisie, according to him, does not group itself politically in accordance with its inner economic interests, not only because of exterior pressure from above and below, but if there's no economic base for the class struggle, and if consequently there are no classes in our society, not only the future, but even the past struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie appear to be impossible, and the social democracy and its successes seem absolutely incomprehensible, or they cannot be understood only as the results of political pressure from the government. Um, she later accuses him correctly of eclecticism, just sort of picking and choosing different things, which makes his arguments, easy to knock down. Um, um, saying later that when Bernstein directs his keenest arrows against our dialectic system, he is really attacking the specific mode of thought employed by the conscious proletariat in a struggle for liberation. It is an attempt to break the sword that has helped the proletariat to pierce the darkness of its future. It is an attempt to shatter the intellectual arm with the aid of which the proletariat, though materially under the yoke of the bourgeoisie, is yet enabled to triumph over the bourgeoisie. For it is our dialectical system that shows to the working class the transitory nature of this yoke, proving to workers the inevitability of their victory, and is already realizing a revolution in the domain of thought. Saying goodbye to our system of dialectics and resorting instead to the intellectual seesaw of the well known, on the one hand, on the other hand, yes, but, although, however, more or less, etc., he quite logically lapses into a mode of thought that belongs historically to the bourgeoisie in decline, being the faithful intellectual reflection of the social existence and political activity of the bourgeoisie at that stage. The political, on the one hand, on the other hand, yes, but of the bourgeoisie today resembles in a marked degree Bernstein's manner of thinking, which is the sharpest and surest proof of the bourgeois nature of his conception of the world.
Yeah.
Pretty
And I
eloquent.
mean, and she goes into like he says he takes from everything, and like I like the general science of mankind as opposed to this Marxist stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And Rose like that might sound good, but like you have to realize it's all bourgeois. If you're not basically solving for that, you're gonna have all those things influenced by that. And it sort of goes into what she says in chapter 10 about opportunism theory and practice, where opportunists hate theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, let's jump right to that. She says, this is now in chapter 10, opportunism and theory and practice. What appears to characterize this practice above all, talk about opportunism, a certain hostility to theory. This is quite natural for our theory, that is, the principles of scientific socialism impose clearly marked limitations to the practical activity, insofar as it concerns the aims of this activity, the means used in attaining these aims, and the method employed in this activity. It is quite natural for people who run after immediate, quote, practical results to want to free themselves from limitations and to render their practice independent of our theory.
Hmm.
A little bit further down the text, she says, opportunism is not a position to elaborate a positive theory capable of withstanding criticism. All it can do is attack various isolated theses of Marxist theory, and just because Marxist doctrine constitutes one solidly constructed edifice, hope by this means to shake the entire system from the top of its foundation. And I think next up she gets to, I think, a point that I think is fundamental to like why I don't like the rise, for example, of everyone starting to call themselves a leftist, right, instead of like a socialist, because leftism is like it's squishy. It doesn't mean
Mhm.
anything, right? It
Right.
means you're incorporating a bunch of different theories, a lot of them coming out of like liberalism, maybe some coming out of socialism, maybe some coming out of just like spirituality, like, you know, like feeling and vibes, to some versus something that is like scientific, an analysis of society to help us break through the confusion. And like the world is big and is complicated, and there's a lot of different countries, there's a lot of different contexts. The point about Marxism is not that it solidly not that you can set your watch to it in the sense of like, okay, this and that is going to happen, but that you actually understand the forces in society, instead of just sort of being bewildered and mystified. Oh, why did Norfolk Southern not invest in their brake rail system? Why is Biden and Buttigieg not fighting against them? Right, like this
Right.
mystifying nature of capitalism that like we're all living under, is the sort of state of conversation for most people in the media, is answered very clearly with Marxist kind of conceptions of like the class struggle, of the relationship of the bourgeoisie and the ruling class to the state, right? This is the point and the reality and the reason why it's worthwhile clinging on, or not just clinging on, like utilizing these ideas. Because she says this, and I just think that this is like a real warning for people, as I do think our movement is becoming too eclectic. I do think that
Mhm.
there is a kind of tendency to say like, well, because of certain terminologies have been, defined and understood by certain people in a certain way, therefore we should, drop this kind of, revolutionary theory. And remember too, like that argument is saying two different things. saying because of like kind of cultural and like aesthetic associations with certain things, we should drop the kind of scientific or philosophical understandings that we have of the system, right? You see how that kind of eclecticism starts to lead to like really sloppy thinking. And she says later in the text, for before Marx and independently from him, there have been labor movements and various socialist doctrines, each of which, in its way, was the theoretic expression corresponding to the conditions of the time, of the struggle of the working class for emancipation. The theory that consists in basing socialism on the moral notion of justice, on a struggle against the mode of distribution, instead of basing it on the struggle against the mode of production. The conception of class antagonism as an antagonism between the poor and the rich, the effort to graft the cooperative principle on capitalist economy, all the nice notions found in Bernstein's doctrine already existed before him. And these theories were, in their time, in spite of their insufficiency, effective theories of the proletarian class struggle. They were the children's 7 league boots, thanks to which the proletariat learned to walk upon the scene of history. And what she's saying there is like this move, and this is the socialist movement in this country, which has a long history, and you can't talk about these things in with like too be too sloppy about these things, because there are people who've just been socialists forever and they've just been in the minority, right? And then there's this explosion in interest in socialism that happens after the Bernie Sanders campaign in this country. But the vast majority of people who get brought into this stuff come from liberalism to progressivism to socialism. And you can see it in the way that people talk, right? Inequality, right? Versus production, right? So that's what she says here is like the focus of these previous socialist movements being solely a question of distribution rather than a question of production. And if you only see these things as a question of distribution, right? If you don't see, wage slavery, if you don't see the kind of laws of capitalism that will constrain a cooperative, like that will constrain a trade union movement, right? If you don't see those as the enemy, but rather the distribution, a fair wage for fair days pay for a fair day's work, right? As correct as those slogans can be in motivating and mobilizing people, your focus again is solely on distribution rather than the engine of the system that creates all these things down the line. And it's this kind of sloppy thinking that in Bernstein's case brings us into revisionism. And I think even more importantly than just solely being revisionist today, right? So at least Bernstein was a revisionist, but he had to contend with like the Marxists and the socialists. Now, like if you want to say there's a revisionist movement today, it is solely because most people's conceptions are completely painted by a focus solely on distribution without that kind of theoretical understanding of capitalism that's provided through Marxism and like the traditional socialist movement.
Yeah. I mean,
let me see. We're almost at the end. We sort of covered that here. Marxist doctrine can not only refute opportunism theoretically, it alone can explain opportunism as a historic phenomenon in the development of the party, talking about the Social Democratic Party. The forward march of the proletariat on a world historic scale to its final victory is not indeed so simple a thing. The peculiar character of this movement resides precisely in the fact that here, for the first time in history, the popular masses themselves, in opposition to the ruling classes, are to impose their will. But they must effect this outside of the present society because the existing society, beyond the existing society. This will the masses can only form in a constant struggle against the existing order. The union of the broad popular masses with an aim of reaching beyond the existing social order, the union of the daily struggle with the great world transformation, that is the task of the social democratic movement, which must logically grope on its road of development between the following two rocks: abandoning the mass character of the party or abandoning its final aim, falling into bourgeois reformism or into sectarianism, anarchism, or opportunism. There's a really nice long section from the 18th Brumaire that she cites. That was the last thing that I had selected, unless there's anything you wanted to bring in.
yeah, no, I do think we should do 18th Brumaire.
Yeah, I know, 100%. Because honestly, it's in terms of like the theory of history of Marx, it's probably one of the most clarifying.
And I think it's like it's so engaging people too,
Yeah.
like that. I love Capital, but I think that's a big hurdle.
I mean, also like what it's like in the first paragraph, he has like the absolute banger of a line is like, "Men make their own history, but they do not do so as they please. They're like weighed down by the ghosts
Yeah. I
of
mean,
revolutions past." Yeah, it's
that's the
good.
thing about the H.G. Romero. Like, I mean, it's Marx flexing as a writer, and in a point where like the tragedy and farce thing. Wait, maybe was that Shakespeare originally?
Oh
Um,
no, Hegel.
Hegel. Okay, shit.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought like, damn, like, Marx got one, but yeah, that was Hegel. That's right.
Um,
But
but
yeah, I
all right,
mean,
let's just read this and then we can
yeah.
give our final thoughts. She before she quotes this long passage in the Brumaire, because I just think this is we didn't get into this as much just because of time, but like a lot of the debates on the contemporary left between like theory and practice are just I think are so outside
Yeah.
of like the actually existing tensions between these things. And I think this really lines it up well. Um, she's attacking in his theoretic arsenal. Marxist doctrine furnished more than a half a century ago arms that are effective against both of these two extremes: bourgeois reformism um, um, and abandoning the mass character of the party. But because our movement is a mass movement and because the dangers menacing it are not derived from the human brain but from social conditions, Marxist doctrine could not assure us in advance and once for always against the anarchist and opportunist tendencies. The latter can be overcome only as we pass from the domain of theory to the domain of practice, but only with the help of the arms furnished to us by Marx. And this is a longer text block quote from the 18th Brumaire. This is Marx. Bourgeois revolutions, wrote Marx a half century ago, like those of the 18th century, rush onwardly rapidly from success to success. Their stage effects outbid one another. Men and things seem to be set in flaming brilliance. Ecstasy is the prevailing spirit, but they are short lived. They reach their climax speedily, and then society relapses into a long fit of nervous reaction before it learns how to appropriate the fruits of its period of feverish excitement.
Hmm.
Proletarian revolutions, on the contrary, such as the of the 19th century, criticize themselves constantly interrupt themselves in their own course, come back to what seems to have been accomplished in order to start anew, scorn with cruel thoroughness the half measures, weakness, and meanness of their first attempts, seem to throw down their adversary only to enable him to draw fresh strength from the earth and again to rise up against them in more gigantic stature, constantly recoil in fear before the undefined monster magnitude of their own objects, until finally that situation is created which renders all retreats impossible and conditions themselves cry out, Hic Rhodus, hic salta. Here is the rose. Here we must dance. Um, yeah, it's just it's a very interesting distinction, for example, between like the bourgeois movements of like the 1800s and of like the proletarian successes. The bit about constantly in a mode of like criticizing of itself, always allowing the opponent to survive until it just finally gets in Marxist terminology to a point where it must be time for this grand action. And this has remained. This is the last bit we'll read from Rosa. This has remained true even after the elaboration of the doctrine of scientific socialism. The proletarian movement has not, as yet, all at once, become social democratic, even in Germany. But it is becoming more social democratic, and to use maybe our understanding, like socialist, right? Surmounting continuously the extreme deviations of anarchism and opportunism, both of which are only determining phases of the development of the social democracy considered as a process. For these reasons, we must say that the surprising thing here is not the appearance of an opportunist current, but rather its feebleness. As long as it showed itself in isolated cases of the practical activity of the party, one could suppose that it had a serious political base. But now that it has shown itself in Bernstein's book, one cannot help but exclaim with astonishment, "What? Is that all you have to say?" Not the shadow of an original thought, not a single idea that was not refuted, crushed, reduced into dust by Marxism several decades ago. And she goes on to basically say that these are some of the tenets of the movement, like her criticism, the Marxist tenets, and that we can hopefully turn our back on the revisionist and opportunist arguments of Bernstein. Unfortunately, as was the reason we brought this text back, a lot of these tendencies still exist, particularly in the U.S., which today has a very different context, obviously, than early 20th century Germany.
Oh yeah. No, if Bernstein was right about this stuff, we wouldn't be fucking around with the, reading this anymore.
Yeah. Well, we've put a full day's work on this. I think this whole thing's probably about 6 hours, Matt. So we've said a lot of what we think, but um, you know, coming on the other side. Any kind of final thoughts on the program or the arguments here?
No, I mean, I'll say just from my personal perspective, like, going into Rose, this is the first sort of thing I've ever read in depth, and as it's as like a object of theory, eh, I appreciate it for that, but I also like the historical perspective,
Yeah.
just like very, frankly, like matter of fact, a view of how like previous centuries have played out. That is
Hmm.
really important, I think, for understanding like what we're dealing with now and how those things like move and how like I mean, just really, I really appreciate that, and to actually to use theory in a way that, like we say, like she's not necessarily here to predict things or forecast, but she did, right?
Hmm.
Like, with regards to all sorts of these fronts, with regards to whether democracy, electoral rights, or unions, and like whether or not those things will ultimately like partner with capitalism to its own overthrow. Like the exactly what she said would happen, uh, did, and it failed.
I mean, I totally agree, and we've said a lot on this, so I won't go on too long. I think that one thing I really appreciate about Rosa and I appreciate about this text is that um, it's able to make some of the necessary criticisms of tendencies like within the socialist movement regarding like cooperatives and the trade union movement, and even like of like democracy, without like falling into the trap of basically saying like we need to reject these things, like because there's a tendency on the left later that basically is like what we have to do is we have to destroy the trade union movement, we have to like attack democracy, we have to like get things into a kind of crisis moment, just like lay them bare. And she's saying no, what we need to do is build up the working class movement, and then the recognition, along with the theory and the political education, but just like the practical recognition of the limitations will sort itself out.
Right.
And I find that to be a bit of analysis that I think is really critical for this moment, because I think a lot of people need to hear and reckon with those criticisms. I don't think they understand them. But then I also see people at times fall into the trap of recognizing these criticisms and then basically saying, okay, well, we're going to reject, these certain things. And, that's not helpful for the movement either.
Yeah.
So I find like Rosa's ability to be a radical, and like a communist and a revolutionary, and to write clearly about these things, to speak clearly about these things, to really show like a dialectical analysis in action, I think is something that's very, very beneficial for people to revisit. And I hope people have enjoyed this series. Let us know what you think, in the comments and all of that. It was a lot of fun. I mean, this is the most ambitious one we've done, but I'm happy. I think we gave it a pretty good ride.
Yeah, yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Well, folks, thanks so much for supporting the show, and we'll be back on Tuesday.
Peace.